Something exceptionally rare just happened.
What? You made a video worth watching?
No, even more rare than that, if I do say so myself. An election in the United States was decided by a single vote. In Cato Parish, in northwest Louisiana, over 43,000 people voted in a race for sheriff. Democrat Henry Whitehorn beat Republican John Nicholson by a count of 21,621 votes to 21,620 votes. That is incredible. Of course, with a margin that thin, there will be a recount. What happens after that, your guess is as good as mine. But even if the recount yields a different result, the fact that it got this close to begin with is truly remarkable. This actually does happen from time to time. In fact, it happened in the same month. In Thomasville, Georgia, a city council election was decided by a single vote. Royal Baker beat incumbent Jay Flowers 824 votes to 823. Weirdly, they did not do a recount. 2 in 1 month might seem like a lot, but think about all of the races in the US that are not decided by a single vote. Out of all the federal, state, and local offices filled through Democratic elections every single year, they're almost never decided by a single person. In fact, most of them aren't even that close. And this is important because it means that nearly every time everyone has voted, the result would have been exactly the same had they not shown up. I voted in some very close elections. The first time I ever voted was in 2008. I was in college in Minnesota at the time, and there was a very close Senate race between Al Franken and Norm Coleman. Franken ended up winning by just over 300 votes. That's about as close of a margin as you'll see in a statewide race. The last election I voted in was 2020. Obviously, that was a presidential election year, but the mayorship of the small town where I lived was also up for grabs. One of the candidates was literally one of my neighbors. I used to watch football with that dude on Sunday. Naturally, I voted for him, and he did end up winning by about 70 votes. So I have some pretty close elections under my belt, and yet I can still say what almost all people who have ever voted can say. The result of the election would have been exactly the same had I not shown up. So who cares, and why does that matter? Well, it goes to show, statistically speaking, voting is an irrational activity. You have pretty much no chance of changing the outcome. So why bother even doing it in the first place? That is the decision that most people make. The vast majority of races see very small levels of turnout among eligible voters. The turnout in the Cato Parish race was about 26%, and the turnout in the Thomasville City Council election was under 15%. Most people, most of the time, don't think it's worth it to go out and vote. The only elections that get significant turnout are high-profile federal ones, which is ironic because they're the ones that an individual voter is the least likely to sway. And even then, high turnout is a relative concept. For example, 2020 had 62% turnout, which is considered very high. 2020 was one of the highest turnout elections in US history, at 62%. That means that 4 out of 10 people who could have voted didn't, and that's considered high turnout. Voting is the classic collective action problem. The individual has no real reason to do it because their action won't change the result. But if a significant number of people think that way, then you really could have a different result in a close race. And that's probably why a lot of people vote, especially in presidential elections. I liken voting in a high-stakes election to people buying Powerball tickets when the jackpot is over $1 billion. Your odds of winning are infinitesimally small, but the ticket only costs $2, so why not buy one? Similarly, your vote probably won't decide the outcome, but why take the chance? Especially given that the act of voting is a pretty low-cost proposition. Despite all the screeching we hear about voting being difficult these days, most people most of the time don't seem to have too much trouble doing it. Every time I voted, it's taken less than 10 minutes. As far as being a pain in the ass goes, I'd put it somewhere between going to the DMV and going to Walmart. In my last video, I argued that biased media is mostly a product of demand, not supply. I would argue that the statistical reality of voting, while it may seem unrelated, actually plays a huge role in making people so biased, and hence demanding biased media. You see, while the act of voting might not take much effort, becoming an informed voter actually does. Think about all the issues at stake in a presidential election. Foreign policy, immigration, healthcare, education, energy, infrastructure, trade, the environment, and social issues, just to name a few. In order to be an educated voter, you have to have a basic understanding of these issues, know where the viable candidates stand on them, and know how their proposed policies would actually affect you. This is a mammoth task in its own right, one that the vast majority of voters aren't actually willing to take on. But it's even harder when you consider that political office holders usually don't make policy by themselves. Just take the presidency as an example. The president can do executive orders, and he can champion certain policies from the bully pulpit, but usually it's Congress that writes the bills. If you remember the minutiae of the legislative battle over the Inflation Reduction Act, we know that the president's vision doesn't necessarily become a law. It has to pass through the meat grinders that are the House and the Senate, and at best it comes out as a compromised version of what was originally intended. So even if you take the task seriously of becoming an informed voter, and you successfully calculate that candidate A is better for your interests than candidate B, and vote accordingly, there's a very good chance that if candidate A becomes president, he won't actually be able to make good on most of those things he ran on. In other words, all that hard work you put into becoming an informed voter will probably be for naught. Most people who abstain from politics are not doing so out of some careful cost-benefit analysis like the one I laid out here. They just have a general sense that it doesn't really matter what they do. And they're right. So why does anybody bother with politics if their personal contributions are very unlikely to make a difference? Well, people have their reasons. My mom always drilled the whole civic duty thing into my head. So that was the reason I paid attention to politics for a long time. Now I at least make a little money off of doing it, but that's an exceptionally rare example. I think most people who pay attention to politics do so for much more tribal reasons. Analogies between sports and politics have always been pretty common.
So I don't know if you guys are football fans, but these days the Raiders aren't playing well. So if you say Trump's like the Raiders, come on, anybody can beat the Raiders. So let's just put up anyone we want in the Super Bowl and we'll win. I'd say, whoa, what are you doing? Why would you put up the Bears? The Bears are the only ones that could lose to the Raiders. Why don't we put the Chiefs up against the Raiders? Granted, that would not be a Super Bowl. I get that. They're both in the AFC. But play the Chiefs. Run the Chiefs. Don't run the Bears.
First of all, as someone pointed out in the comment section when I first played this clip, the Bears actually destroyed the Raiders this year. Second, the analogies work pretty well because the two things have a lot in common. For example, there's nothing terribly rational about being a sports fan either. There's no good reason why I'm a Green Bay Packers and Milwaukee Bucks fan. I just happen to have been born in the state of Wisconsin. The actual outcomes of games only affect me in ancillary ways. Like most people, the big way in which it impacts my life is the emotional response I have to the outcomes of games. You get to experience the joys of winning and the anguishes of losing. You get the pleasure of watching your rivals get humiliated, like when Bears fans convince themselves that this year is different, only to realize 20 minutes into the season that their team is the same dumpster fire it always has been. The thing about psychic benefits, or drawbacks, from sports is that they're basically optional. The second you check out is the second you realize that it really doesn't matter. I don't care about the Milwaukee Brewers at all. So it doesn't matter to me on an emotional level whether they win or lose. Craig Counsell even went to my high school, and I couldn't have cared less when he went to manage the Chicago Cubs. And the same is true with politics. If you check out, you begin to realize that the whole red team versus blue team stuff really doesn't matter. Don't get me wrong, it still matters which party controls Congress or the White House, as they can pass laws that will affect you, but that was going to happen anyways. And like I said earlier, there's basically nothing you can do to change that. And much like sports, the team bias affects the way people analyze information. Let's say you're watching a football game, and the refs make a controversial call. How will the crowd react? Even if you've never seen a football game, you already know the answer. The crowd will almost certainly boo if the call goes against their team, or they'll cheer if it's in their team's favor. This is exactly how people consume information in politics. As Ilya Soman writes in Democracy and Political Ignorance,
Republican partisans who reflexively despise President Barack Obama and Democrats who reflexively support him against criticism might well want to acquire information in order to augment the experience of cheering on their preferred political team. If this is indeed their goal, neither group is likely to evaluate Obama's performance in office objectively or accurately. This intuition is confirmed by studies indicating that people tend to use new information to reinforce their pre-existing views on political issues while discounting evidence that runs counter to them. For example, experimental evidence shows that political partisans not only reject new information casting doubt on their beliefs, but sometimes actually respond by believing in them even more fervently. One study shows that conservatives presented with evidence showing that U.S. forces failed to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were actually strengthened in their pre-existing view that WMDs were found. Similarly, liberals confronted with evidence that 2004 Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry had incorrectly claimed that the Bush administration had banned stem cell research persisted in their pre-existing belief that the charge against Bush was correct. A recent study, sponsored by the Yale Law School Cultural Cognition Project, found that even otherwise mathematically sophisticated people grossly misinterpret statistical data on political issues in ways that fit their pre-existing ideological views. Although some scholars view such bias as irrational behavior, it is perfectly rational if the goal is not to get at the truth of a given issue in order to be a better voter, but to enjoy the psychic benefits of being a political fan.
This is a phenomenon the economist Brian Kaplan calls rational irrationality. Since psychic benefits is one of the few reasons why people get into politics, they're likely to interpret news in very self-serving ways. This is why people tend to seek out news sources that validate their priors. And as much as I bash new media, I actually do think this is one aspect in which new media is slightly better than legacy media. New media people are way less likely to be partisan cheerleaders. I still think they validate a different set of priors for their audience, and thus serve a similar purpose. But at least it's not in a partisan way. So what's the solution? Should we all just become enlightened centrists and constantly applaud ourselves for our objectivity? Obviously, I don't think enlightened centrists are actually objective, so that's a non-starter for me. I don't think better media is the solution either, because, like I said before, I think most of the problems with media are demand side. Once again, our girl Anna Kasparian actually has good sense when it comes to this.
We have to find solutions for this. I don't know what we can do.
More responsible media, I guess.
I know, but I mean,
Which
we've
seems
been
impossible.
fighting that battle I've been here for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, hey, the reason why we cover these Fox News segments is because if we don't debunk the lies, then no one will.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been debunking the lies. It hasn't, anyway.
I think it's helped a little.
My solution is to make elections less important by making politics less consequential. Delegate decision-making to the lowest level possible, preferably all the way down to the individual. Collective decision-making through democracy just doesn't get great results. And, as I've argued here and in other videos, it actively incentivizes people to be more biased. You do need it for some things, but we have politics in all sorts of places it doesn't need to be. This is something that I could talk about for hours, so I'll have to save it for future videos. Take care for now, and I will see you soon.